Modern Singapore might be considered a jewel in the crown of Asia, but this wasn't always the case. Just 50 years ago, Singapore was not a rich country. In fact, in 1965, it had been expelled from a union with Malaysia, partly due to its high unemployment rate. Add to this that Singapore had no natural resources and little farmland. It appeared to offer almost nothing except more people who would need feeding and looking after. However, fast forward to today, and as we now know, Singapore's economy has boomed. Even during the late 2000s global financial crisis, Singapore's economy was growing steadily. In fact, in 2010, it grew by a whopping 15%. This economic success might all be thanks to just one geographic feature, which is the all important Malacca Strait, which I realise most people have never heard of. So let me explain. Absolutely everything which travels by boat between East Asia and the Middle East, including the Suez Canal, must pass through the Malacca Strait. Looking at Google Maps, you can see that Singapore sits right at the narrowest end of the Malacca Strait, the point where there are the most choke points. And by zooming out, we can see that the Malacca Strait is by quite a long way the shortest route to transport goods from the Middle East and the Suez Canal to Asia and China. There's no northerly maritime route, and things like oil are much easier to transport across the sea. There are other routes to the south, like this one which passes nearby Jakarta, but these would add weeks to a maritime journey, and they have choke points of their own, so they can't be considered any better. This geography can explain why Singapore has become so wealthy since the 1970s, and especially since the 1990s. It all stems from when China opened up its economy to global markets, and we all know how that turned out. It created an enormous economic boom, and China became the factory of the world. This had especially big ramifications for Singapore because, as you can see from this photo I took whilst landing at the airport, the volume of trade passing through the Malacca Straits became enormous. As I mentioned, about 80% of China's energy imports pass through these straits, as do many of its food supplies. The Chinese economy is completely dependent on these straits remaining open. Of course, the simple act of ships sailing past your country isn't going to make you wealthy, but the fact that you could help block them, even in theory, has made Singapore wealthy. If a war ever did break out between the USA and China, the Americans would want to block the Strait of Malacca with the help of Singapore. Blocking the strait would cut off the Chinese from their most vital energy supplies. In fact, Beijing has labelled what it calls the Malacca dilemma to be its single most important vulnerability, more so than Taiwan. Thanks to the Malacca Strait, both the American and the Chinese governments have been trying to woo Singapore for decades. Singapore is one of the few countries in the world which has been given a free trade deal by the United States of America. It was signed in the year 2003, and it was described by journalists as a reward for Singapore being a close American ally. It allows Singapore to export very easily into the American market. For such a small country, this has had a huge impact on improving people's living standards. The Chinese have also been trying to win over Singapore with investment of their own. It became a key part of China's plans for its Belt and Road Initiative. Again, because Singapore is such a small country, this investment helped to create a huge economic boom through the 2010s. All things considered, the reason behind Singapore's remarkable economic growth since the 1970s, and especially since 2009, seems to be related to its geography. Admittedly, unlike most wealthy countries, Singapore does not have any valuable natural resources and it has very little farmland. It just has people who need feeding and looking after. However, those people are lucky enough to live right next to the most important choke point in global geopolitics. This alone seems to have been enough to make it a valuable trading partner, and through this trade, it has become a jewel in the crown of Asia. Thank you very much for watching, and if you like this video and want to hear more about how geography creates history, please hit the subscribe button.